Welcome to the New Ventures podcast, Davinia Cogan. Davinia is a program manager at the Energy for Impact, but what she's really known in our circles is the work in clean energy access crowdfunding. Davinia, tell us how you got into this whole thing.
Yeah, sure. So I actually started my career went to university and, did the sensible thing of getting an undergraduate in commerce and then went into finance, even though I knew from quite an early age that, I didn't want to be working in an office block in a big city. And so I was always, I guess, fascinated by Africa. At that time, I really, I'd never been to the continent. I didn't really, have much of an understanding of the diversity of countries there. But for some reason, I was just, pulled, I guess, to doing work there. And so I, started off my career, worked for a couple of years in the office block and sort of thought, well, what is this? Have I really, done all this school and university just to kind of sit here and essentially make rich people richer? And so I started a master's in international relations. And then I finished that, and it was around the time of the financial crisis, like in 2008, 2009. And the company I worked for was divested by the European headquarters, and I was in Australia at that time. And so I basically, got about, I think, 6 months or so payout salary. And so I decided, okay, well, now I'm going to go to Africa. And I ended up working in Uganda, just volunteering for 6 months. And that was more in the NGO kind of space. And then I decided, okay, well, like charity isn't necessarily for me, but I do have this background in finance. How can I sort of put that to good use? And at that time, I still had savings left. So I was able to do a couple of internships and fellowships in various places. I was always really interested in, microfinance. Once I, sort of heard of the concept, later on in my high school years. And so I moved to Tajikistan and worked with actually a crowdfunding platform called Kiva, and worked with 4 different microfinance institutions in Tajikistan. And then I worked also in London in impact investing, and then moved back to Uganda and began working for Energy for Impact.
Oh, great. And then one thing led to another. From what I know, that you spent some time in, you worked in both Nairobi and Kampala, and then you came back to London and started this crowdfunding program. What prompted you to think about crowdfunding?
Yeah, so I'd spent a couple of years working in both Kampala and Nairobi, and it was, our role was essentially to provide pro bono, management consultancy type services to off-grid energy companies. Well, I definitely became frustrated that none of the companies I worked with were raising capital. It seemed like there was just such a big gap between the expectations of investors and what they were looking for and what was actually going on the ground. The project I was working on was funded by the Swedish government, but we also had, a number of other projects that we worked on with the UK government. And at that same time, peer-to-peer lending and crowdfunding was really taking off. This was about 2015 in the UK. And so the FCDO, the UK government, was interested in seeing, could crowdfunding be leveraged in more of this, for the sustainable development goals? Could it be leveraged so that we would, raise debt or grants or equity from the UK public to fund different energy access projects and companies in sub-Saharan Africa? And so we just began those conversations. And eventually, that led to the design of the Crowd Power program, which has now been running for almost 6 years.
And this is what I find really fascinating. Let me tell you a little bit about my background and why I thought, your work in crowdfunding is so important. I started my work career in energy finance, supporting entrepreneurs exactly the same way as you did, running a program called New Ventures, which was funded by Doon Foundation, and then later on actually funded by USAID in a partnership with the Miller Center in Santa Clara University. I face this exact same problem. You can work with the companies as hard as you can, but there are really no institutional investors, or at least very few institutional investors who want to invest in this space. And so when you started working in crowdfunding, I found it so very interesting because it's a real solution to this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it still maybe suffers some of the same issues that we see in the more traditional impact investing space, where there is a concentration of funds within, say, the top 10 companies in the sector. But apart from that, there are crowdfunding platforms that are looking at African-led companies. They're also looking to provide much smaller ticket size transactions. So it just makes it a lot more accessible. Many companies, they need, someone that is willing to provide debt or equity when they're really early stage, before they're able to absorb, say, $1 million a year in loans. They need someone there to provide 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, so they can establish that track record that they're borrowers that repay their loans, and then the borrowers are getting the access to capital so that they can grow their companies.
Exactly. So I just read your recent report called Crowdfunding Energy Access. And it struck me that the 57 million that has got funded into energy access alone last year is quite a significant number, right? It's about 10% of the total investment in this area. Just tell us a little bit about how this held up during the COVID year.
Yeah, so before COVID, we were seeing basically a doubling of the crowdfunding energy access related crowdfunding volumes each year. And I think by the end of 2020, about $160 million had been raised altogether since we began tracking data in 2015. 90% of that now is debt. But during COVID, it didn't affect all types of capital equally. So within the debt market, we definitely saw a reduction in lending. We saw on some platforms up to a 60% reduction in volumes in 2020. But then we also saw on some platforms, particularly Kiva, I'm thinking of the one in the US, and they do lending to microfinance partners that provide direct to end user loans for, say, solar home systems. But they also do direct business loans where they'll provide between $10,000 and $50,000 to energy access companies as a working capital loan. So Kiva really actually ramped up their lending. And I've just been analyzing the numbers from last year, and they basically doubled their lending during 2020. And that's really because Kiva's more of a philanthropic platform, whereas many of the platforms in Europe that provide loans with interest. Kiva, for example, is a zero interest lending platform, or they have very low interest rates that just cover their the transaction costs. But what we saw with the European platforms was that because they're more of an investment product, I think they have different, risk considerations to a platform like Kiva. So it was really the platforms in Europe, I think the debt platforms that are lending to, say, those top 10 companies in the sector that were really hit hard by COVID. But then on the other hand, you also have equity crowdfunding, which grew tenfold in 2020. And, we don't understand exactly why that is, but I would say, what we often see when we speak to entrepreneurs about equity crowdfunding is that it's really the last resort for them. They don't necessarily choose to do equity crowdfunding, but it's usually, after they've spent about 12 months meeting with different, venture capital funds, PE firms, impact investors trying to raise capital, and they've just been unsuccessful during that process. And so they do turn to equity crowdfunding. And so what I wonder is that during 2020, when a lot of investors on both the debt and equity side paused, I wonder if those firms then felt, well, let's actually do crowdfunding instead. And one of the platforms in the UK, it is the biggest equity platform, it's called Crowdcube. I think they actually had a record quarter in Q3 2020, their best quarter, in, I guess, something like 6 to 8 years of operation. So I think that sort of goes to show that equity crowdfunding actually grew during the pandemic.
Great. So just so that I understand this, some platforms got hit by COVID, mostly debt platforms in Europe, which had an investment style of product. On the other hand, Kiva, which is in the US, and which is also, the way you are defining it, is a debt platform, but with low interest rates, actually grew multiple times. And equity platforms also grew. So overall, when you compare the COVID year versus the pre-COVID year, in energy access alone, did the overall number of 57 million hold up between those 2 years? How did that, just give us insight into that?
Yeah, good question. So overall, it did shrink. It shrunk by about 25% during 2020. And, when we compare that to those previous years where we saw, 100% growth, it's not following the same trajectory as the previous 5 years. But at the same time, I think 25% is probably not too bad in the context of how shocking 2020 and the early months of 2021 have been so far.
Right. Okay, great. So, you've started already talking a little bit about types of crowdfunding, right? Maybe this is a good time to just tell us about the various types and the various platforms that exist and the options that exist for both an investor and an entrepreneur.
Sure. So the big one is debt. So debt is 90% of energy access crowd lending. And within your debt crowdfunding, you basically have two different models. So one is the direct lending to businesses. These are typically loans of about $10,000. There was a huge one, I think in 2019, it was a transaction that was about $8 million on the Trine platform. So you can see there's a massive range. And then the other model that you see within debt crowdfunding is the micro loans. So they are more like the loans that go directly to the end users, and they range from about $50 if it's something like a Pico solar lantern and perhaps mobile charger, up to about $5,000 for something like commercial scale cold storage.
And then you talked about equity crowdfunding. What type of energy access companies do equity crowdfunding?
Yeah, so equity crowdfunding is still really quite restrictive. The regulatory side of it basically means that, it's only European-based companies that are able to use equity crowdfunding. It is slightly different. And then now, obviously, with Brexit as well, there are also a number of changes. So the biggest equity crowdfunding platforms are in the UK. The UK has the most mature market because the regulations for equity crowdfunding came in over a decade ago. So that really has given the market the chance to grow. There's been that certainty. While in many sub-Saharan African jurisdictions, they either don't have bespoke regulation that governs investment type crowdfunding, or it's outright banned. So places like Nigeria, SEC is the regulator, I think, in Nigeria. They have banned equity crowdfunding and debt crowdfunding. So it basically means that most of the companies that end up raising on equity platforms, they might have operations in sub-Saharan Africa or some parts of Asia, and then they will also have a company that is domiciled either in the UK or elsewhere in Europe. And pre-Brexit, there was quite a smooth passporting system. So like a Swiss company could raise on a UK-based platform. But that all, I think, is changing. And now there are new regulations in the EU to make it much easier to raise across multiple jurisdictions within the EU, which I think for some of these larger platforms will be really beneficial. But for some of the smaller platforms, it could increase cost and competition for them. And that for me is a little bit disconcerting, because I think some of the most exciting platforms that we work with are smaller platforms, and they're the ones that are doing the smaller ticket size transactions, which are not as profitable, but it means that they're serving more borrowers, they're much more inclusive. Most of the smaller platforms like Charm Impact in the UK, and then there's another one, Wagenzi Fund, that recently launched in the Netherlands. They're providing sort of $10,000 to about $100,000 debt and equity investments into mostly African-led companies. So I think it's important that those types of platforms are really supported.
Absolutely. But, getting back to equity crowdfunding, we had on our podcast a couple of weeks back, Toby Hammond of Future Pump, and he is a CEO of Future Pump, and they did a fairly reasonable raise on Crowdcube, the platform that you talked about earlier, in the UK. And they're, of course, UK domiciled companies from what I know, but they have operations in sub-Saharan Africa. Are there any other types of crowdfunding platforms apart from debt and equity?
So you also have, I guess, early on, people probably would have heard of crowdfunding more from what we call a reward-based crowdfunding model. So that's like your Indiegogos, your Kickstarter, those ones that I think like really made a name for themselves about 5 years ago or so. There's one company called Waka Waka Solar that did a number of raises and raised, I think, several millions of dollars actually on Kickstarter and Indiegogo. But those examples are so rare. And I think it's in some ways been quite unfortunate, because it's led to a bit of a misconception around crowdfunding. And I've seen, some people in the space sort of focus on, looking at the success stories of a company like Waka Waka, which sells a solar powered light that looks a little bit like an iPhone. And so one side of it is a PV panel, and then the other side is the light. And, these are the sorts of things I think that they, look cute to a funder in, a Western country. And they're like, oh, okay, yeah, I want to donate. Well, it's not really a donation, because you're getting a product in return. So these donors, they go into these campaigns and they see the product, and they're really excited, I think, more by the product. And it means that some of these companies actually end up raising a lot of capital on reward platforms, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their business is viable or that the product is suitable for the end users. And so these products, was intentionally created for Western audiences, which are the ones that tend to contribute to the reward campaigns. But once, they start to deploy the units on the ground in, say, a country in East Africa, they realize that the product is not appropriate, and the product has probably been designed from a very Western mindset. And it also means, because of the success of these campaigns, that there can be, a lot of hype around the company. There can also be a lot of hype around reward crowdfunding. But in reality, I think there are two companies, Waka Waka and Gravity Light, that have used reward crowdfunding to raise what I would call a substantial amount of capital. There are some other examples of companies that have used reward crowdfunding really early on in their journey. So they would use it, say, to raise about 10 or 20,000 US dollars as a proof of concept. So it's usually a seed round or like family and friends. It's kind of like a way to formalize that fundraising process. But these are really tiny transactions, sort of like 10 to 20,000 USD, and that is really just as a proof of concept. They might be able to produce like a minimum viable product from that and then do some market testing that they can then iterate from there and hopefully go on to raise money from other grant makers and eventually debt providers.
I think the point that you make about the product being cute and very useful for a Western audience who donates or invests in the product, but it not having a market actually in sub-Saharan Africa is very important. I think that's probably the reason why reward crowdfunding really took off for energy access. Perhaps can take off for, let's say, climate adaptation projects. Invest in adaptation or conservation project with the reward of being able to spend a month there. Maybe it'll come back. Who knows? With that, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
In this podcast, Davinia has given us an orientation of what crowdfunding is all about. In the next part of the same podcast, we will take a deep dive and explore how local African entrepreneurs can take advantage of crowdfunding.